Hello, everyone. Welcome to Grid Infrastructure Solutions webinar series, where we will bring you strategies for navigating policy, procurement, and project delivery in energy infrastructure. My name is James, and I will be your MC for today's session. First, let's get the legal stuff out of the way. The views, opinions, and information presented in this webinar are for general educational and informational exchange purposes only, and do not constitute legal, financial, accounting, investment, tax, or technical advice. You should not act or rely on any of the content without seeking specific independent advice tailored to your particular facts and circumstances. Neither GIS nor its affiliates, employees, or advisors shall assume any liability for errors, omissions, or how users choose to use the material. In order to manage the attendance to its events or webinars, GIS will need to process certain information from you. This information of your participation to this webinar will be kept by GIS on your customer profile. GIS may record the webinar. So, in today's session, we are going to cover political policy has become one of the biggest problems we face. In the next 40 minutes, we will cover everything you need to know in today's global market. We'll go over the tools used in this administration, what that means in real-world terms, and answer any questions you have. Speaking of which, please use the Q&A or chat features on this webinar to submit your questions as they come up. We will select the best questions to answer live and send out battery packs to those that submit them. Just a quick introduction of our company. Grid Infrastructure Solutions, or GIS, aims to be the single source partner for energy equipment procurement, connecting U.S. projects directly to global and domestic manufacturers. We specialize in power transformers, battery storage, and everything you need to get them connected. And now for our hosts. Mahir Durman has over 20 years in energy engineering and tech, and of course, with 25 plus years of experience in energy infrastructure, Randy Parole. And with that, I'll hand it over to Randy to dive into today's procurement landscape.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone, wherever you're calling from. We named this session T&D Procurement in a politically driven market because, like it or not, decisions in Washington, D.C. have been dictating how those of us in the distributed and renewable energy industry do business in this country. With Biden administration's IRA bill, we saw how tax incentives helped to drive more renewable and utility projects to not only help support an aging grid, but drive for a cleaner source of energy and reduce carbon footprints. Now with the Trump administration and their punitive tariff policies, with a focus on fossil fuel, like drill baby drill and coal, we're seeing an extreme pivot from one administration to the other. And in our industry, it's feeling the brunt of this. Today, we will discuss the perils of tariffs and policies on the domestic and international marketplace, and how Grid can support procuring your equipment to meet your requirements, whether it's reduced lead times, domestic content, pricing, or specific OEMs. I'd like to get started with a review of the tariffs and the policies that will affect every order you place for any piece of equipment you require in the near future. First of all, I'd like to talk about the OBBA, and I think we're all familiar with that today, known as the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. As we all know, OBBA eviscerated the IRA bill passed by the Biden administration, which promoted renewable energy projects. The ITC, investment tax credit, was a big part of assisting renewables into the marketplace. While good for the industry, no industry can be sustainable if total reliance is on government incentives to financially pencil. Later on, Mahir will be reviewing where the ITC stands as of today and where it still applies. Number one, FEOC. If you're not familiar with FEOC, FEOC stands for Foreign Entity of Concern. It's a company that is prohibited foreign entity, which is a PFE. It's not eligible for ITC tax credits, grants, rebates, or government-backed loans if procuring equipment, software, warranties, O&M services, financial backing, consulting, etc., from a FIAC country. Presently, there are 4 PFEs: China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. If you purchase from any of these countries, you're not going to be able to use the ITCs. In fact, we recommend using a third-party certifier to verify products, software, and services to ensure that they're free from FIAC at all. If you get it wrong with FIAC after your project is done and you're audited, you could experience mass losses, loss of tax credits, which could result in 20 to 45% of project revenue income streams. And then there's fines on top of that of 20% of the total cost of the project or more. So it's super important that you understand FIAC, you understand any entity that is using anything coming from any of these 4 countries. The next one, number 2, is 201 tariffs. This refers to a temporary import relief measure imposed under Section 201. It was a Trade Act of 1974, and it was meant to protect U.S. industries that are being seriously injured or threatened by a surge of imports into our country. An example of that, the 201 tariffs, they're typically capped at a 50% above existing duties and can be imposed for an initial period of up to 4 years, extendable to a maximum of 8 years. In 2018, under the Trump administration, Section 201 tariffs were imposed on imported solar modules. These tariffs were extended and modified by the Biden administration in 2022. The third issue tariff here is Tariff 301. And these are additional taxes imposed on imported goods by the U.S. government under Section 301. This was a Trade Act of 1974. This allows the U.S. Trade Representative, the USTR, to investigate and respond to foreign trade practices deemed unfair. The 301 tariffs are not applied to all imports. This is the difference in this tariff. These are specific. They are specific to products that could be causing harm to specific industries in the U.S., such as China being able to, bring in whether it's solar cells or any other products that could be harming our industries here in the U.S. Number 4 is IEEPA, and IEEPA is an acronym for International Emergency Economic Powers Act. That was put together in 1977, a federal law. This grants the president the authority to regulate international economic transactions in response to declared national emergencies pertaining to threats from foreign entities. Donald Trump, in 2025, he evoked IEEPA to impose tariffs on various countries, citing national emergencies related to trade deficits, illegal immigration, and fentanyl crisis. Presently, those are being challenged in court, but there has not been an actual ruling on that from the Supreme Court yet. This IEEPA is pretty damaging because the president himself can claim what is an emergency. And those powers have been given to the president, which allows him to really go after any country that he deems is a threat, whether it's politically or financially. Number 5 is the 232 tariffs. These tariffs are imposed by the U.S. president, again, under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. And this is to adjust imports that are deemed to be a threat to national security. These tariffs have been applied to goods like steel and aluminum and copper. And this is something that the Secretary of Commerce investigates and then goes to the president and shows if it's hurting our country with bringing in these goods at a lower cost. A good example of that is presently we've got a 50% tariff on copper and steel coming into this country. The problem with that is we're also being pushed towards domestic use of products. And now a lot of these products are being hit with that 50% tariff. If you look at copper and steel, copper obviously is used in transformers and a lot of the electronic equipment that we purchase for T&D. The other thing is steel. Steel is also used in the components as well. It's used in containers for BESS equipment, for racking, for other items that you may be purchasing for T&D. And last but not least, this is one that you may or may not be familiar with. It's called the anti-dumping duties. These are also taxes. They're called duties, but basically they're taxes. They're imposed on specific foreign products that are found to be selling their goods in a domestic market unfairly with low prices. And this is called dumping. This occurs not on a regular basis, but if you have China all of a sudden with a glut of, let's say, PV panels, and they start lowering the price and dumping them here in the country with low prices, this is to protect against that. And these duties are also to protect the domestic manufacturers for unfair competition. Recently, the investigations have targeted solar cells, as we all know in this industry, and they were looking at countries like Cambodia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam, where those panels were coming through those countries at much, much lower prices. And most of those were Chinese products being shipped to these countries, and some final screws and assembly, and then shipped off. As you can see, procuring under these parameters can be precarious, especially with most products having lead times that can be more than a year, and in some cases 3 or more years. With the state of geopolitical discourse we're witnessing today, a simple procurement order can be difficult to navigate. The rules could change at any time, with an administration using tariffs politically and punitively, and with the president being nicknamed Taco, which means Trump always chickens out. You have a huge amount of uncertainty moving forward, and this uncertainty can sink your project before it even hits NTP, or even after you've issued purchase orders for your product. Those tariffs could change in a day, a month, or a year. This is why working with a knowledgeable resource like GRID is a key to your project's success. Mahir is going to be speaking next, and he's going to discuss how to plan for the future, how ITC rules have changed. He'll also discuss how GRID can cut through the red tape and procure equipment based on the specific requirements for each project. Thanks for listening, and please submit your questions on anything I mentioned here, and we'll get to those questions towards the end and answer them for you. Mahir, take it away.
Thank you, Randy. Very valuable information. Thanks everyone for joining us. Good morning and good afternoon. So let's walk through this slide in detail, because this is where the technical merits, reality, more so, meets the policy requirements. What we're looking at here is the need to meet that 40 to 55% domestic content threshold. Just to be clear on this, that number applies to the overall project cost, not each individual components. So in other words, a certain percentage of all the manufactured products and materials across the entire projects need to be US made. And this is for that project to qualify for certain incentives. Now, when you look at the actual numbers in this table, you start to see why this becomes challenging very quickly. For example, we can look at the solar cells here at the top of the table here, which makes up a significant portion of that total system cost at around 18 to 28%. But the US manufacturing capacity right next to it is relatively limited compared to the overall demand, especially when we consider the pipeline currently we're facing. When we move to the inverters, they actually account for 10 to 15%, but again, the domestic capacity, if you look at it, at 7 gigawatts, which is nowhere near enough when you compare it to the scale these projects are being planned. Now, I want to pay attention to the transformers, of course, which is really the biggest bottleneck in the entire sector. Only about 20% of transformers supply is domestic, And this really puts a pressure on the lead times. And when you consider multiple projects simultaneously chasing that domestic content eligibility, this becomes imminent and very clear. So what do you do in this case? What do we do when the domestic manufacturing simply can't meet the schedule or the volume that a project needs? This is where you start sourcing them from alternative locations, from FEOC compliant regions. And this is a crucial strategy. If you can't get a domestic transformer within the lead time your project requires, you might source it from a manufacturer in a friendly FEOC compliant region that can meet the US specifications. That allows you to maintain progress in your project while still balancing the overall domestic content calculations across the full project. This is really a balancing act if you really see it that way. Using domestic content where it's really available and strategically important, then the rest of it you fill the gaps with the FEOC compliant alternatives. And then, this is where a procurement specialist becomes very important. The specialist is constantly monitoring the global capacity, domestic bottlenecks, origin compliance, and lead times. They help you assemble a sourcing plan that keeps your project both compliant and on schedule. This is going to be increasingly more difficult in the coming years. So without that kind of a visibility on the vendor side, this could be even more challenging. So the key takeaway from this slide is meeting the domestic content threshold is just not a checkbox. It's truly a strategy and a project level optimization problem. You use domestic manufacturing when it has the most impact, and you rely on compliant international sourcing to fill the gaps. So this project can move in progress and get built on time. And I would like to add one last clarification on this slide. This 40 to 55% domestic content threshold only applies if you're after certain incentives like the ITC that Randy mentioned and various other tax benefits. It does not mean that a project cannot be built if it doesn't hit these numbers. It simply means that certain financial incentives may not be available. That's why planning this mix early and working with specialists can make a significant difference. Let's look at the next slide, where I'm going to take a little bit smaller approach and go in a little bit more detail, because there are several important elements here that really work in hand together. Let's talk about first on verifying documents and establishing transparent vendor relationships. Whenever you're sourcing components from different regions, whether domestic or FEOC compliant alternatives, having clear auditable documentation is very important. Now, a third-party inspection agency is not mandatory, but it's a very effective tool in order to accomplish this. A third party can go on site, verify the manufacturing process, and provide independent documentation. In case you get audited, this gives you solid proof, and it helps you protect your ITC eligibility. This is, again, another area a procurement specialist becomes an extremely valuable asset. A specialist can coordinate all this documentation, the supplier transparency, and the third-party inspection you decide to choose, and you have everything prepared and organized. Now, let's move on to the ITC ramp down in details. I'm going to start with the solar side. For PV projects, photovoltaic projects, in 2025, projects can still claim the full 30% base ITC, although there's only a short amount of time left. In 2026, this is going to curtail down to 60% of that original value. In 2027, it drops down further to just 20%. So for an example, if you are aiming for a 30% base rate for your project, the same project you develop in 2026 would only qualify to 60% of that, hence only 18% of the final value. And in the following year, in 2027, only 20% of that, so that's only 6%. So after 2027, what happens? Unfortunately, the current schedule eliminates ITC for solar projects completely. This may change in the future, we'll see that, but this is the current schedule. And you can see the way things are moving. The solar timeline is fairly aggressive. That makes timing extremely important. Let's take a look at how things are on the battery energy storage side. The path here is very different. Beginning in 2026, battery projects must meet a domestic content threshold to qualify for the full ITC. So this number, for instance, for 2026 is 55% of the project costs must be domestic content, and each year it will increase by 5%. For example, 2027, it raises to 60%. In 2028, another 5% up to 65%. In 2029 to 70%, and by 2030, it reaches to 75% domestic content. So when we look at the battery side, the ITC remains available at full rate until 2030, but the domestic content bar rises steadily each year. I would like to talk about safe harboring here, because this is an important tool for locking in the ITC values. There were historically two ways to safe harbor a project. The first way was the 5% rule, where the project could lock into the ITC year by incurring at least 5% of the total project costs. Unfortunately, this option has expired for 2025. However, it's still available for smaller projects at 1.5 megawatt AC output or lesser. For the utility scale projects and larger projects, DG projects, unfortunately, it expired back in September. The second option, the begin construction test, is still active and valid. This means that if you begin construction under IRS guidelines, you can effectively lock into the ITC rate for that year. So this makes safe harboring a very powerful strategy if you want to preserve the higher ITC rates before they step down. And again, a procurement specialist can guide you through that process, identify what needs to be purchased, documented, or initiated so the project qualifies under IRS rules. Finally, I'd like to talk about planning for the shortages in the near future. Because of the competitive environment and limited availability of certain domestic components, especially transformers, inverters, and other long lead items, we are fully expecting supply constraints. As more developers rush to secure equipment to meet domestic content thresholds and the ITC deadlines, the queue will only get longer and longer. And if you take an approach such as wait and see, your project may end up in a waiting line for a long time. But the correct approach, in our opinion, is to work with a procurement specialist proactively, who monitors the global capacity, domestic bottlenecks, and FIAC compliant alternatives. You can stay ahead of these shortages, secure allocations early, and keep your schedule intact. From this slide, the key takeaway is to verify the documentation early, understand the ITC ramp down for both solar and storage, use safe harboring strategically where needed, and prepare for upcoming shortages. Again, grid can be a very valuable asset here, and tie all this together for your projects to move confidently and stay fully compliant. Now let's walk through the next slide, where I will be talking about friendshoring and diversification, and I'd like to define them first. Friendshoring is the practice of sourcing critical components from allied countries, places that share economic and political alignment with the US, which helps create a more stable and predictable supply chain. Diversification means spreading your sourcing across multiple trusted regions, so you're not overly dependent on a single country or supply channel. In other words, you don't put all your eggs into one basket. In practice, that means looking beyond just domestic sources. For example, if inverters are difficult to obtain within the US lead times, you might source them from Germany, which has strong established inverter manufacturing. If transformers are delayed domestically, you might look at South Korea, which makes very high quality grid equipment. And for certain specialty components, Canada can be a reliable option. They have strong trade alignments and short logistical routes. Each of these sourcing options comes with its own tariff implications, of course, and those tariff implications significantly influence your procurement strategy. If we look at the tariff landscape, I'll give you a few examples. For example, components imported from Turkey often come with tariffs around 15%. Imports from South Korea also typically carry around 15%. sometimes higher depending on the exact component. But if you look at countries in Southeast Asia, such as Vietnam, Malaysia, and others, tariffs on certain electrical and solar-related goods can reach as high as 49%. Understanding this range is very important because tariffs directly affect the project cost, which usually drives the decisions. And the procurement specialist, again, I'll repeat it, a crucial role in navigating these layers. They can evaluate which region offers the best combination of compliance, lead times, tariff impact, and FIAC alignment. They also maintain the vendor relationships needed to diversify your supply chain efficiently and confidently. And as I hold these slides, I would like to sum up. And when you bring all these things together, the documentation and verification practices we discussed earlier, the ITC ramp down timelines, the safe harboring strategies, the domestic content thresholds, now the role of friendshoring, diversification, and tariff awareness, you begin to see how these elements connect into one cohesive procurement strategy. A strategy that keeps your project compliant, cost-effective, and resilient in a highly competitive and supply-constrained market. Thank you very much for your time. We will now answer your questions.
Okay, so now we're going to open up to questions. Let's see if we have any in chat. Are the presenters on LinkedIn to connect? Yes, they do each have a LinkedIn page you can find. We will share that with you in follow-up emails if you'd like to connect with them directly. You can also email them directly. We will present you with their emails at the end of this presentation if you'd like to connect with them specifically. There's also links in the chat. Do we have any other questions? How do you locate a procurement specialist? Randy, maybe you want to handle that one.
Well, it just so happens you're on with a procurement specialist. This is what we do. We go through this process once you provide us the specifications and really what your needs are. Do you need to shorten the lead time? Do you need lower pricing? Does it need to be domestically based? Can you use Chinese product? These are the things, the information that we collect initially, along with the specs on the product itself. And then we use our team to go and procure based on what your actual needs are. So yeah, we can help you there.
Great, thank you, Randy. That's a response from Yvette in the chat. Another question I saw was, Mahir, you mentioned Safe Harbor, that it's no longer available. Is there no way to get Safe Harbor in the year 2025 at this current juncture?
It is still possible. There were two ways in the beginning. Now one is eliminated, which was the 5% of the project cost. But the construction started check is still available. We can strategize on that. You can begin your construction based on the IRS guidelines, which qualifies your construction to be assumed as started, and you can lock in on that year's ITC rate. This year is very valuable because you're collecting 100% of your claims. The next year and on is curtailed, so which is not a complete loss, but it can significantly impact the project finances. So to short answer, yes, it's still possible.
Okay, great. Does anybody else have any questions in the chat? I see David is typing. Okay, so David asks, how do you even begin to attempt any friendshoring relationships with a single tweet or post on X? Tomorrow could end any potential trade relationship with a given country. Say you have already entered a fixed firm bid for a project, and the cost of the imported equipment has already baked in a 30% margin. Now there is a 50% tariff on the hardware from the country you intended to import from. Is there any way to proceed without having to break the contract entirely?
I can perhaps answer this. We actually have real examples on this. Friendshoring and diversification does not mean you need to buy similar projects from different manufacturers. It could be the same manufacturer, but they have different origins for their supplies or manufacturing. So essentially, that's really what diversification means, that you de-risk your future that way. You can plan on procuring certain equipment, and if certain tariff changes or there's a political change, like if FEOC list gets extended to include that country, then in that case, diversification comes into place, that we can source that same item from an region outside that new territory that's in the FEOC or a very harsh tariff. And again, if you need a large quantity order, it might make sense to mix and match it with different manufacturers perhaps, but again, it's not a necessity. Even within the same item category and the same manufacturer, there are ways that you can diversify and ensure your procurement. We have done it before, and surely it's a very sound option that everybody should explore.
Thank you for that explanation, Bahir. Another question I saw on our LinkedIn page. This one's for you, Randy. So FEOC means no foreign entities of concern. Does that mean that Chinese products are just essentially off the table for any current projects?
No, you can still use Chinese product. It's just that you would not be able to utilize any grants, any federal funding that could be used to assist in the project itself. So that would be grants, that would be any loans that are backed by the federal government in any way. But the way we look at it is, let's say you've got a project that is going to COD in 2 years, and it's in flight, but you have a transformer that's going to take 5 years, right, to get here, and it could, slow your project, or you wouldn't even be able to get it started in time. You can still order that Chinese product and utilize that product. You're not going to get the ITC on it, but you will get your project completed in a timely manner and start revenue, right away. So it's a balancing act, really. The price is going to be a bit less from China. Their transformers are typically less, even with the tariff involved. But you have to kind of outweigh what those costs are and where your project is at, really. So you can use Chinese product. There's no limitation except for utilizing any federal funds.
I see. Thank you for that explanation.
I may add to that, in certain cases, you may be forced to use Chinese products because that may be the only option.
Right. Right. All right. So one last question I saw on our social media. Maybe this would be best handled by Randy. So there's news about the tariffs being reversed in the Supreme Court. Has that happened yet? What does that mean?
Yeah, no, it has. The Supreme Court has not made a decision yet. As I stated before, if you look at all of those tariffs, taxes, they all are in play, right? So, frankly, the Supreme Court is a friend of the administration, as we've seen with their decisions. I don't think they're going to completely, this is my personal opinion, by the way, I don't think they're going to completely deny tariffs at all. I think there'll be some kind of a play on that where, one of those tariff duties that I brought up may be in play, but I don't think they're going to eliminate all of these. And that's really what the administration knows and why they've done this, by utilizing all of these different laws that are in place, all the 6 that I mentioned, so that if some get taken away, others can backfill. And really, we did name this, procuring under a political environment. And, someone asked the question earlier, what happens if the tariffs go away or if something changes, or, we don't know, if President Trump is angry at a country because, they are taking the former president and putting him in jail, like in Brazil, because he's a friend of Trump. They tacked on 50% tariff there. These are the uncertainties that are going to be with our industry for a while, and that's why it's so difficult to navigate and understand. And we have, the legal folks, we have the folks that have a bead to Washington, D.C., to understand what's happening in real time and to be able to pivot for you. So, it really is a day-to-day thing. Things could change tomorrow. Things could change in an hour. They could change in a month. So that's why you have to really have a professional that's on top of it.
Okay, well, gentlemen, thank you very much. That's all the time we have for questions today. And thank you everybody else for joining us. We will be sending this presentation to all attendees, and we'll be in touch with anyone that won a free battery pack. If you still have questions or need some help with any of your current projects, we are happy to help. Send an email directly to our hosts at the email addresses you see here, or schedule a meeting at your convenience by scanning the QR code you see on screen.
Hey, James.
Thanks again. Yes?
I did see one more question come in, and we can kind of squeak it in if you want.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see that. David asks, as far as you can tell, are there harmonized standard tariff codes even used anymore? There used to be a huge difference between importing raw materials and completed parts and complete assemblies, but now it seems like there is no pattern to what components cost more or less. Some items...
Yeah, I mean, to answer your question, you're absolutely right. That's what's creating chaos in our industry, and really, even beyond our industry. Because if you start to think about, inert items used in a lot of manufacturing that we do, they all have some kind of a tariff, and they all might be different tariffs as well. Copper and steel. Those are tariffs across the board coming into the country. So it really is, harmonized tariffs have really gone away, and we're really looking at more targeted tariffs. I mean, these are targeted towards political enemies. These are targeted towards countries that have tariffed us, that our administration feels that it was unfair, and frankly, the amount of the tariff is at whim of the president, really, today. Whatever your political views are, whatever side of the fence you're on, they affect all of us. And again, that's why you really have to be on top of it.
One more question in that same chat. Is there anywhere to turn for more info?
I'm sorry?
Is there anywhere to turn for more information?
For more information, such as, if you reach out to us, we can discuss your project, what your needs are, and really kind of guide you through the process. We have a whole department that works on our procurement. We have relationships internationally, as you could see on that map, to be able to draw from. And these are relationships, we're not just calling on OEMs that we don't know. And these are relationships we've been doing business with for a few years, and are able to, get ahead of some of the other projects that may be, they may be manufacturing for. In some cases, we can move projects ahead of other projects just because of relationships. Again, we can provide you with additional information if you want. Just reach out. And there's,
thank you.
By the way, we don't charge for providing, that kind of consulting. We don't charge a consulting charge for that. We just want to make sure your projects are fulfilled with the equipment that it's needed.
Okay, great. All right, so there's one last question that came in. This is concerning Brazil. How is all this context interfering with the buying and selling of electrical grid equipment between Brazil and USA? Have any impacts been identified yet, considering that more equipment is sold from the USA to Brazil than vice versa?
Yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with selling product to Brazil, but I do have a little history in that, and there are heavy tariffs selling product to Brazil, and buying product from Brazil right now, the tariffs are very high, and part of it is retaliatory because we've always paid very high tariffs to sell product into Brazil, which made it almost punitive on our part. So, presently, Trump has put these tariffs in place. Someone asked the question, what if the tariffs do go away? That's a really interesting concept. I don't think they're going to, as I mentioned before. I mean, can you imagine having to refund all the tariffs that have been in place for the past several months? We're talking about, billions and billions of dollars. I don't see that happening. Maybe for some, but I don't think that I don't think these tariffs are going to go away all too soon. This is what the president ran on. This is what our people voted him in on. Whether they thought he was maybe not serious about it or not, it's very serious at this point, as we all know. So again, it's about staying ahead of it and understanding the tariffs and how they apply to, what we're trying to procure.
Okay, well, we've covered quite a bit here today.
Before you close, I would like to add one point here. I would like to ask all the attendees to give us feedback. We would like to have this on a recurring order. We need subjects. So on this one, we talked about the political climate and planning ahead. But one subject that pops in my head is Project Rescue. We didn't get into that because it wasn't out inside our project webinar scope. I know planning ahead is important, but I know there's a lot of projects that needs rescuing, that are stuck in the queues, that are, whether it's from the utilities, the interconnection, permitting, or some long lead time items. This is one subject we did not get into in this webinar, but this is also where we shine as well. We can actually tap in, become your not only procurement specialist, but a strategic partner. Because we have a very diverse portfolio of specialists in this company, and some of us come from utilities, some of us come from different parts that actually affect these project developments. Most definitely we can talk about that if everybody would be interested, but we're also open to other ideas on what subjects we should have the next webinar on.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you, Mihir. Thank you both for your informative, all the information provided, and to everyone who attended, thank you from the GRID team. We are happy to have you here, and hopefully we'll see you on the next one. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.